How exciting, right? So I thought this gives us, Dr. Basu gave me some extra time so that I could review the stuff that's gonna be on the exam a week from today. I mean, the celebration, a week from today. Our celebration of learning is 1 week from today. It'll be Dr. Basu stuff, like 85%, I think, and like 15% of my hepatic clearance, which I know now you're like, who cares then about yours? Well, you have to care because it's gonna also be on the final. And it all builds. So I thought we'd spend some time right now going through this kind of review of my stuff from the beginning. Because all of it, as you know, kind of builds on itself, just to remind you, okay? And get the rust maybe knocked off of all of that. Does that sound like a plan? Yeah. They are posted, I think. If they're not, I'll fix that. It's called Putting It All Together. I don't know what module it's in. Were you able to find it? No. I probably didn't turn something on correctly. Sorry about that. Can I make this small? Oh. All right, should have it now. Can you find it now? All righty. So we're going to do a quick review of all the concepts that we have discussed starting at the beginning of the semester. All right. So we started with dosage regimen design. And as you know, we need to determine the dose rate, which is the amount of drug we're giving per time, and then the dose interval, which tells us how to chop up that dose rate. So how often do we need to give the drug, right? And we know that in order to determine our dose rate, which is the amount of drug per time we're going to give, we're going to be targeting a particular CSS average, right? Does this all sound familiar? And what determines physiologically in the body, what determines the CSS average? Well, it's the drug in over the drug out, right? That's our average concentration at steady state. So drug in is bioavailable dose rate. We also have to count for the salt form. The salt form is just a salt form. It really doesn't have much to do with the physiology, right? Because it just dissociates as soon as it hits the water. But we have to think about the bioavailable dose rate and the clearance of the drug. And that will determine our CSS average, which determines our dose rate, right? Everybody good? Because what we control here is dose rate. You know what salt form is? S stands for the percentage or the fraction of the drug that we give, the salt form that we give that actually is the drug itself and not the salt. Bioavailability is the fraction of drug that we give that makes it to the systemic circulation. Clearance is the efficiency or the amount of blood or plasma that can have all the drug removed from it per time. And we know what CSS average is, right? The dose interval, on the other hand, is determined by the peak to trough ratio. And the two terms here that we see are K and tau. We control tau, and K is determined by clearance over volume. So the peak to trough ratio will really be determined by how often we give the drug and the clearance and the volume. Can I just move you like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And of course, K and half-life are just inverses of each other. So our half-life actually is a determinant here. And again, clearance and volume are the determinants of half-life and K, the slope of our line, right? Everybody clear on this? This all makes sense and is second nature to you now, right? Good. All right. Okay, so then we go into the three things that we just talked about, which are bioavailability, clearance, and volume that determine our CSS average and our peak to trough ratio, right? Along with dose rate and dose interval, which we control. So we're digging deeper on bioavailability, digging deeper on volume, and digging deeper on clearance. So bioavailability, what determines the bioavailability of a drug? Well, you all should be thinking, well, bioavailability is determined by the fraction that gets absorbed times the fraction that makes it through the gut wall times the fraction that it makes it through the liver. So those three things have to happen in order for the drug to make it to the systemic circulation. So it's FA times FG times FH. FA is the fraction absorbed, and that's usually through passive diffusion. So you have to think about all the things that affect passive diffusion, right? Make sure it's unionized, small enough, right? What else? What am I forgetting? Oh, lipophilic enough. All right, then it has to make it through the gut wall. And we know in the gut wall, we have CYP enzymes and P-glycoprotein. So it has to make it through both of those things that are trying to either destroy or move our drug back out of the gut wall. So those two things determine FG. And these two things are limited numbers. So there can be love triangles and drug interactions with all those things, right? Drug and food interactions. Grapefruit juice is one with the CYP enzymes. FH, and then it goes to the liver, then it has to make it past the hepatic enzymes. And when we first studied bioavailability, we didn't really know much about hepatic clearance, but now we do, right? So we know that this FH is really dependent upon E, right? 1 minus E, our extraction ratio in the liver. And then we have to consider, do we have a low extraction or a high extraction drug? Well, we have low extraction drugs. If we have a low extraction drug, then most of the drug makes it through the liver, right? The enzymes are not that active against the drug. So most of the drug, approximately 100%, will make it through the liver. So the FH is approximately 1 for a low extraction. Remember, that's our rusty dairy where the workers are kind of disgruntled, and the rate limiting step is enzyme activity and binding. And really, most of the drug makes it through the liver without being metabolized. However, high extraction drugs a lot of it is removed, and it's dependent upon blood flow and intrinsic clearance. FU is in here, but it's that funny fraction unbound because these drugs are non-restrictively cleared. Do you remember what non-restrictively cleared means? Or maybe we should start with restrictedly cleared. Low extraction drugs are restrictively cleared. What does restrictive mean? Huh? Yes. They notice your ring. So only free drugs, see, these goofy things sometimes stick, right? The only free drug is available for clearance. So if you're bound to a protein, you're protected from being metabolized by the enzymes. If you're a drug, that's restrictive clearance. Non-restrictive means doesn't matter, right? So that's why this fraction unbound is seen by the liver as all being free because it doesn't care if you're bound or not. Doesn't care if you have a ring on or not. So notice really none of these things change FH here for a low extraction, but for a high extraction, both blood flow and enzyme activity changes will change the fraction that makes it through the liver and therefore the bioavailability of the drug, right? And this is where you see drug interactions that are concerning because, again, with a high extraction drug, very small percentage of the drug is making it through the liver anyway. So if you make changes, either making it smaller or larger, it's going to be a large percentage change in the amount that gets through. Does that make sense? If 50% is making it through and you make a 10% change, it goes from 50 to 40 or 50 to 60. That's maybe important, but not really important. If you started with 5% and it goes from 5 to 15, that's tripling the amount of drug that's making it through. Or if you go from 5 to 1, right? So the smaller percentage that makes it through makes it more critical to pay attention to changes in that. Does that make sense to everybody? And this is why there's route dependence or route to dependence, right? Is where it depends whether it's given IV or PO. We'll see a big difference with high extraction versus low extraction in this case. What does bioavailability determine? Can you tell me that without going to the next slide? What does bioavailability determine? Why do we care about bioavailability? Does it affect CSS average? Yeah, we care because it changes. It's one of the determinants of CSS average, right? Can everybody get on board with that? It's also going to change your area of the curve, right? Will it change half-life if there's a change in bioavailability? No, that's right. It will not. What determines half-life? You don't have to be shy with me. If you make a mistake, I'll try not to publicly. Volume of distribution and clearance, right? Very good. See, volume and clearance. You guys are remembering. That's great. But bioavailability mostly affects CSS average, not half-life. Dot K, not time to steady state. But it affects how much drug gets into the body, right? So that's a pretty big deal. So a change in bioavailability will often mean you need to change your dose rate, right? But not your dose interval. Everybody good? Logan, you made a face. You good? All right. Now we're going to move on to volume of distribution. Weird how that slide came out. What determines the volume of distribution? What determines volume of distribution? Notice we're saying what determines a thing and then what does that thing determine? Both sides of it, right? What determines volume of distribution? Does this equation ring a bell? VSS is equal to volume of plasma plus volume of tissue times the fraction amount of plasma over fraction amount of tissue. So those are the things that determine your volume. That's the physiologic things in the body. The volume of plasma, the volume of tissue times that ratio of fraction unbound in the plasma over fraction unbound in the tissue. And we know in general, the volume of plasma is much smaller than the volume of tissue, right? About 3 liters in a 70 kilogram person of plasma versus 39 liters of tissue. So the biggest compartment is that tissue compartment, and that tissue compartment is made up of all kinds of different tissues. I'm overgeneralizing when I say tissue compartment, because that includes muscles and bones and eyeballs and toenails and, right, heart, fat. And you can parse out each of those and have the volume of fat, the volume of muscle, the volume, right? But we're lumping those all together to make simplify things, to have your tissue volume. And then what it really comes down to is that ratio between fraction bound in plasma and fraction bound in tissue. If the drug is more highly bound in that big tissue compartment, highly bound, that means it's stuck there. Because if it's bound to a protein, it can't move, right? Then if it's stuck there in the tissues, then it can't move. That's a relatively large volume of distribution. If it's more highly bound in the plasma, in the little compartment, then it's going to have a relatively small volume of distribution, because again, it can't move into that bigger compartment. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, I think about it and where it's bound, but notice the equation is fraction unbound. So you have to be able to think that through, right? The equation is fraction unbound. You can always figure these out using the equations, but you have to just think it through properly. Is everybody good with that as we move on? Well, then why do we care about volume of distribution? We know what determines it now, but why do we care about it? What does it determine? We just said it, didn't we? What does it determine? Does it determine CSS average? No, it is not a determinant of CSS average. So change in volume should not affect your dose rate choice. But what does it affect? Half-life and elimination rate constant, and as Aaron said, dose interval choice, right? How big of a chunks are you going to be chopping your daily dose into? So volume affects the slope of that elimination curve, your K, your half-life, your time to steady state. Does that make sense to everybody? Is this all coming back pretty quick? Hopefully, if you learned it well the first time, you're probably like, move on, we've already got this, it's fine. It also, your central volume of distribution also is going to be a determinant of loading dose. All right, we're going to just take a little dive into protein binding. So what determines protein binding? Remember this equation that should look to you much like a Michaelis-Menten form, right? Of an equation where our concentration bound is equal to our N total, which is a number of binding sites available, times our unbound concentration all over KD, which is our affinity constant, or the concentration of drug where half of those binding sites are full, plus unbound concentration. So there's a limited number of those binding sites. And this is saturable. This is a Michaelis-Menten. So KD is analogous to KM and determines the affinity. And N total is analogous to Vmax and determines the capacity of the system, the number of binding sites available. Does that make sense to everybody? So what does protein binding determine? Well, it's a determinant of volume distribution, isn't it? And therefore a determinant of half-life, K, dosing interval. It also is a determinant of clearance for low extraction drugs. You can skip that third one because we haven't talked about it yet, but we're going to be talking about it soon. But when fraction bound in plasma changes, you cannot trust the C total, right? If binding changes, we can't trust the total concentration to tell us what's happening with free. Remember, we measure total concentration and we look at total concentrations to determine what's happening with concentration. And we can trust it as long as there's no binding change. Remember, that's what you guys were parroting back to me like the Baptist choir, right? So as long as there's no binding change, you can look at total to tell you what's happening with free. But if there's a binding change, then you have to dig deeper, don't you? Because free concentration is equal. This is the important part here. Free concentration is total concentration times fraction unbound. So protein binding is very important, isn't it? Protein binding. You don't know this yet, but protein binding, and it comes up again and again. Because you also know that only free drug is active. If a drug is bound to a protein, it can't interact with the receptor either. Because protein, being bound to the protein is all the drug can do. Can't do anything more. Makes it inert. Finally, clearance. What determines clearance? Well, we know that it's blood flow to the organ and the extraction efficiency of the organ. In general, clearance is Q times E. Now we're going to just work on this part of the equation or of this flow chart because we haven't done this part yet. So don't worry about this right now. But you can come back to this to study for your final, which I would suggest that. So first of all, what is our FE? The FE is a fraction of drug unchanged in the urine. So I don't know, does Dr. Basu call it FR? Can't remember. Everybody calls it something different, but this is the fraction that ends up in a fraction of drug given that ends up in the urine unchanged. So it really is the fraction cleared by the kidneys renally. So an FE of 0 means none of it's cleared by the kidneys. And then we assume that that is all cleared by the liver. That may or may not be true, but we're going to make that assumption for this class. So if we know the FE is 0, then we know it's hepatically cleared. If its FE is 1, then we know it's renally cleared. We're not going to worry about this yet because we haven't learned it yet. But we have learned hepatic clearance. So what is the E? Is it a high E or is it a low E? How do we determine that? Well, if we have the clearance and we know a Q is 90 liters per hour, and we know, and this is hepatic clearance, and this is hepatic blood flow, we can determine the E, can't we? Unless it's given to you. And obviously the closer it is to 0 means low E. The closer it is to 1 means high E. If it's a low E drug, we celebrate a little bit because FH is 1, therefore there's no route dependence. And clearance is approximated by enzyme activity and binding. Makes life a little bit easier. And we can tell that it's restrictively cleared because the extraction efficiency is less than the fraction unbound. Only free drug is being cleared. That's restrictive clearance, isn't it? High E drugs, clearance is approximated by blood flow. Remember, this is our rusty dairy, the low E. High E is our shiny dairy, where we're just waiting for the drug to come in. We'll take care of it, just get it in here. Okay, Here we do have route dependence or route dependence or route dependence. And this fraction unbound, because it's non-restrictively cleared, becomes approximated by 1 because the liver sees it all as fair game. The E is greater than the fraction unbound. In other words, we're extracting or clearing more than just free drug, which means it's by definition non-restrictive. And we do have route dependence, right? So what does clearance determine? Well, you tell me, what does clearance determine? What, Aaron? Dose rate and dose interval, because it affects both CSS average and your peak to trough ratio, because it is a determinant of K and half-life, isn't it? So it affects both. Therefore, when there's a clearance change, we're going to expect a need to change both. What determines intrinsic clearance, like digging deeper on that low extraction drug where it's intrinsic clearance and binding? Well, intrinsic clearance is determined by Vmax, or the number of enzymes, Km, the concentration where you've got half of those enzymes full, and concentration, another Michaelis-Menten situation, right? So we've got our capacity and our affinity. So the number of enzymes and the Km are what determines your intrinsic clearance. But what does intrinsic clearance determine? It determines, it's one of the determinants of clearance for a low extraction drug, and it's a determinant of bioavailability, or FH, for a high extraction drug, isn't it? If it's given orally. Phew. Pharmacodynamics is sort of a separate issue that we'll discuss here, just review real quickly. What determines the effect at a given concentration? Well, we start with our sigmoid Emax model, which also can be called the Hill equation. I should tell you that, so you're not thrown if you see Hill equation. It's the same thing as a sigmoid Emax model, which is our Emax times our concentration with this slope factor of gamma, all over C50, which is our concentration where we're at 50% effect raised to the gamma plus concentration. Again, this is a Michaelis-Menten, isn't it? Our capacity is Emax, our affinity is C50. C50 is also a measure of what? What does C50 measure? Somebody mouth it to me if you're afraid to say it out loud. The lower the C50, the higher the, thank you, potency. That's right. The lower the C50, the higher the potency. So potency can be determined by comparing C50s. Does that make sense to you? The lower the concentration needed to get to 50%, the more they're attracted to each other and the more potency you're going to see in that drug, right? All right, I think we covered all that. So what does pharmacodynamic determine? It determines target concentrations needed for given effects. And you should probably also compare, God bless you, you should also consider, you remember our hystereses, our clockwise and counterclockwise hysteresis. Do you remember all that? I didn't put that in here. I probably should have. So we're always looking at concentration effect relationships, right? And if our concentration goes up, we expect our effect to go up. And as our concentration comes back down, we expect our effect to come back down, don't we? But if that doesn't happen, if you've got our concentration going up and our effect going up, and then our concentration still going up, but the effect coming down, what does that tell you? That's called a clockwise hysteresis. And what could cause that? tolerance, right? Or as, even though the concentration is going up, the effect is coming down, right? That's tolerance usually. And how about the other ways? If your concentration is going up and your effect's going up, your concentration is coming down, but your effect is going up. Eventually it comes back down again. That's a counterclockwise hysteresis. And what could cause that? In general, that's a lag, isn't it? There's a lag in the effects. So that can be caused by an active metabolite, like a prodrug situation. What else? If it has to get to a particular effect site. So you're measuring the blood, but the drug actually has to get to the muscle or to the CNS or to the heart to actually have its effect. There's going to be a lag, isn't there? That's the effect site. And then finally, the turnover model, which is, we used warfarin as an example. Warfarin works by inhibiting the making of vitamin K dependent clotting factors. So you have to wait until you stop the making of the thing that you're trying to block. So there's a lag, right? Physiologically, you can't really relate the concentration of warfarin to its effect directly. It's about a 3-day lag for that because of what you have to do. You have to inhibit that, the making of those clotting factors. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right, so now we're gonna have a quiz.